Why was the general's voice the only thing anyone could hear? The morning had been quiet, almost fragile in its stillness. Wyoming's sun just beginning to stretch across the grasslands, the wind carrying the faint smell of dust and sage. That stillness shattered in an instant. A convoy of black SUVs barreled down the dirt road, throwing up a tail of pale grit like a storm front on wheels. Engines growled, tires crunched. The Broken Arrow shooting range, normally the domain of local ranchers, hunters, and the occasional weekend hobbyist, had just become a stage. Doors flew open, men spilled out. Not just soldiers. These were the sharp-edged, tightly coiled kind. Delta Force marksmen. Full tactical gear. The kind that didn't just keep you alive, but announced, without words, that you'd been places most men wouldn't survive. Their boots hit the ground in unison. Weapons gleamed like surgical instruments under the rising light. Crates of precision rifles, spotting scopes, ammunition heavy enough to supply a battle. All of it began to fill the firing line with military order from the weathered trailer near the edge of the range. A figure emerged, slow, unhurried. A woman in her 50s, overalls stained with a lifetime of work, boots worn to softness, gray hair tied back in a ponytail that didn't care about appearances. She carried a dented thermos, its lid doubling as a cup, and took a slow sip as the scene unfolded. Her eyes moved over the men, their formation, their gear, their urgency. She didn't step forward. She didn't smile. She just watched. "You boys here for the range rental?" she asked finally, voice carrying across the dust with the calm patience of someone who'd seen all kinds pass through her land. A slight drawl, not exaggerated, but worn in like her boots. General Marcus Hartwell barely looked at her. His attention was elsewhere, barking orders, positioning his men, scanning the terrain like he was still in the streets of Fallujah. Without breaking stride, he waved her away, as if swatting a fly that had wandered too close. "Just point us to the target." "Sweetheart," he said, sharp, clipped, like every syllable had been drilled into him. "We're here to show these country boys how real soldiers shoot." It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't even a statement meant for her. It was a declaration, and his men responded exactly how he wanted them to. Laughter, the kind that fills the air too quickly, too loudly. Sergeant Rodriguez, all shoulders and forearms, made a show of unpacking his rifle, glancing at her like she was watching something she couldn't possibly understand. Corporal Jenkins, barely old enough to drink, muttered something about rabbit hunting and shotguns. Another soldier, Specialist Thompson, grinned, pointing out the open expanse like it was a novelty. A strange little corner of nowhere. She didn't answer any of it. Instead, she began walking downrange, a stack of targets under one arm, setting them at distances that stretched further and further toward the horizon. She measured each placement, adjusted angles, made small tweaks that none of them noticed or cared to. Behind her, the general's voice kept carrying stories from combat zones, snipers in the sand, calculations and wind calls shouted over explosions. His audience ate it up, stealing glances at her now and then, smirking when she glanced back when the targets were set, some fixed, some gently moving in the wind. She returned to her crate beside the trailer, the thermos balanced on her knee. Her face didn't betray a thing. "Ma'am," Thompson called out, still wearing that easy grin, "you might want to stand back when we start. These aren't the kind of guns you're used to hearing out here." She nodded, one slow dip of her head. No argument, no comment. The first cracks of rifle fire shattered the air moments later. Controlled, measured. Targets at 200-300 yards dropping in tight groupings. Spotters called adjustments, scopes glinted. The general moved behind the line like a proud conductor, gesturing toward her between shots. Never seen shooting like this out here in cow country. "I'll bet," he called. "These boys have had the best training in the world. $500,000 per man to get here." Specialist Thompson added his own flourish. as if she needed clarification. "This is precision marksmanship, ma'am. Not like hunting deer or plinking cans." She looked at him for a moment, unreadable. Then her gaze drifted back downrange. The shooting continued, more steel rang, more laughter drifted over the wind. Every man on that line was certain they were proving something today, certain she'd leave with a new appreciation for their world, their skill. And then, without hurry, without any change in her tone, she asked the question that pulled every eye to her. "Mind if I give it a try?" The laughter this time was bigger, sharper, echoing against the hills. Rodriguez almost dropped his rifle. Jenkins slapped his knee. Even Williams, who hadn't cracked the smile all morning, let out a low chuckle. "Oh, this is rich," Rodriguez said. "Lady, do you know what you just asked? These rifles kick like angry mules." Thompson, emboldened, leaned in. "With all due respect, maybe start with a .22 at the local shop. These things take years to master." The general loved it. Loved the story he'd already be able to tell. Later, the simple countrywoman, the challenge, the bet. "If you can hit the closest target," he said, gesturing grandly toward the 100-yard plate, "coffee's on me for everyone in town." Phones came out, videos started rolling. They wanted every second of what they thought was coming. A flinch. A miss, maybe even a stumble. She stood, walked to the line, reached for the general's custom rifle, and the first thing they noticed was the way her hands touched it. Not like it was foreign, not like it was dangerous, like it was familiar. The laughter didn't stop all at once, but it thinned. And for the first time that morning, none of them could quite tell what was about to happen. What was it about the way she held the rifle? The weight didn't bother her. Not in the way they'd expected. No awkward shuffle to get comfortable. No searching for the right grip. Her hands slid along the stock, fingertips grazing the cold. Metal as if reacquainting themselves with an old friend. The general's rifle gleamed under the Wyoming sun. A $15,000 piece of precision engineering. The kind of weapon that even seasoned shooters approached with respect. She didn't seem impressed. Not in the way they understood it anyway. Her fingers found the scope styles without hesitation, making minute adjustments. Not the random fiddling of someone pretending to know, but exact. Deliberate turns, one click here, half a click there. She didn't even glance at the general. Though he was watching her now with a smile he thought was still condescending. Phones were up, recording. Soldiers leaned in, ready to catch every stutter, every flinch. Rodriguez muttered something under his breath about ambulances. Williams smirked, already predicting the recoil bruise she'd be nursing tomorrow. Then she stepped forward. Her boots sank slightly into the dry earth, and she shifted, just enough to anchor her stance, a stance so clean, so stable, that it made Rodriguez's eyebrows twitch before he caught himself. She didn't rush. She didn't even seem to hear them anymore. The world narrowed to the line of the barrel, the wind grazing her cheek, the steady rhythm of her breathing. "Jesus," Rodriguez whispered before he could stop himself. "Look at her." The crack of the first shot split the air. Spotters jerked their binoculars to the far targets. Not the 100-yard plate the general had mentioned, not even the 200 or 300 they'd warmed up on. She'd gone straight for the 400-yard steel. The echo rolled back across the prairie. "Dead center," Williams said, voice flat. 400, bullseye. Nobody moved for a moment. Even the wind seemed to pause. The second shot came faster. This time, 600 yards, a range none of them had touched that morning. The steel rang again. Perfect center. Phones, once held steady for mockery, now wavered. Faces changed. The smiles tightened. She didn't look at them, didn't acknowledge the shift in the air. Just worked the bolt, chambered the next round, and found another target. Wind-gusted, unpredictable, sharp, the kind that made even skilled marksmen adjust twice, maybe 3 times. She didn't use a meter, didn't consult a spotter, just felt it. Targets fell, steel rang. Clay shattered in midair. Jenkins stopped recording. His arm had gone slack at his side. Rodriguez counted hits under his breath, as if that could make sense of it. 15 shots, 15 hits, all different distances, all different angles. The general's smirk had vanished entirely, and though none of them would admit it, not yet, there was a new question hanging in the air. Not how was she doing this, but who exactly was holding that rifle? How many shots did it take for them to stop breathing between them? By the third round, nobody on the line was joking anymore. The sound of her shots was sharp, decisive, not rushed, not hesitant. Each one had that strange inevitability, like the target had been marked for death before the trigger was ever pulled. She didn't just hit, she erased. Steel plates rang in the distance with an almost musical purity, each note exactly where it should be, and she wasn't following. Their rhythm, the slow, deliberate, by-the-book pacing they'd all been drilled in. Her cadence was her own, and it shouldn't have worked. Too fast in some moments, too unhurried in others. She shifted from standing to kneeling in one fluid movement. Her balance so steady, it was like the earth had agreed to hold her still. No readjustment, no scope search. Her eye found the glass the instant she settled, and the next target fell. Winds up to 15. Williams muttered, almost to himself. She's not even? He stopped. No point finishing the sentence. Rodriguez tracked her with binoculars, his jaw tightening. She's compensating on feel. No meter, no spotter, I don't. His voice faded. The words didn't matter. At 600 yards, she pivoted to a target on the far right, an angle that forced an awkward body position for anyone who'd learned to shoot by doctrine. For her, it might as well have been straight. Ahead, the steel sang again. Phones were lowering, arms folded. The air felt heavier, tighter, and still, she didn't look at them, didn't feed off their reaction, didn't need it. The moving targets, the ones they barely tested earlier, fell one after another. Wind gusts that would have thrown. A bullet wide seemed to bend to her will. A tin can, barely visible at 800 yards, disappeared in a silver puff. She's not sighting each time, Jenkins said, almost whispering. She's tracking and braking in one motion. Rodriguez finished. His voice was flat now. This wasn't just skill. This was something that didn't fit inside their world. The general stood behind them, hands clasped behind his back, but there was no pride left in his stance. His eyes were fixed on her, watching the rifle in her hands like it had betrayed him. He'd seen good shooting before, legendary shooting, even, but this wasn't that. This was something he didn't have a category for. Her last run was impossible. Steel plates at varying distances, each one meant to be engaged in sequence, forcing her to adjust for bullet flight time, elevation, wind, all in real time. She fired so quickly the sound of each report still hung in the air as the next one cracked. The plates fell in perfect order, like a code being punched in when the last one rang and went still. She lowered the rifle, no celebration, no satisfaction on her face. She set it down the way a mechanic wipes a wrench and places it back in the box. The only sound was the wind in the grass, and now, every man on that range was thinking the same thing. This woman, the one they'd called Grandma an hour ago, didn't just know how to shoot. She might be the best they'd ever see. Why wasn't she even out of breath? The Wyoming air was dry, brittle in the lungs, but she stood there like the last hour had been nothing more than a casual chore, as if she'd been sweeping a porch, not rewriting every rule of marksmanship. In front of an elite unit, the rifle's barrel still whispered faint heat into the morning, faint curls of smoke twisting upward like incense at a quiet altar. She didn't glance at it. She didn't need to. Her eyes were on the horizon, as if she was reading something out there none of them could see. No one spoke at first. It wasn't just silence. It was restraint. They were all holding back the same question, afraid that saying it aloud might make them sound foolish, or Worse, admit what they'd been forced to witness. Rodriguez still had the binoculars up. But he wasn't looking through them anymore. His hands were trembling, the lenses drifting inches from his face, as though he'd forgotten what they were for. Jenkins' phone was hanging loosely at his side, the recording still running, catching. Only the sound of prairie wind and the faint creak of someone shifting their boots in the dirt. Thompson's smile, the easy, patronizing one he'd worn all morning, was gone. In its place was something heavier, something you only saw when a man realized he'd been dead wrong and didn't have a quick joke to cover it. General Hartwell stood motionless behind him, jaw tight, eyes on her. He didn't blink often. It was part of his command presence, but now he caught himself doing it too much. His thoughts were a churn of disbelief and calculation. He'd seen snipers in Afghanistan and Iraq hit unbelievable shots, but none had done it without wind meters, without a spotter calling adjustments, without even the smallest pause between entirely different ranges. The men glanced at each other, hoping someone else would break the silence first. Nobody did. It was Hartwell who finally spoke. "Who," he said, voice low measured but strained, "taught you to shoot like that?" Her head turned just enough to acknowledge him. No expression, no triumph in her eyes. "Life," she said simply. It wasn't an answer, and yet it was. The general took a step closer. He wasn't smiling now, but he was still trying to keep his voice in the realm of casual authority, like he was in control of the conversation. "That grouping at 600, he said. That's not chance, and that wind drift correction. I've seen trained men miss those by a foot." She didn't respond, just picked up her thermos, poured a small stream of coffee into the metal lid, and took a sip. The act was so unhurried, so utterly ordinary, that it made the tension worse. Rodriguez finally lowered his binoculars. "Sir, I've been spotting for 15 years. I've never seen anyone shoot like that. Not in theater, not in competition, not anywhere." Jenkins shifted uncomfortably, muttering under his breath. "That's not in the manuals, none of it." Hartwell ignored them, still watching her. "I've got men here who've survived some of the worst combat zones on the planet. I've got snipers who could split a playing card at 500 yards. And I've never seen what you just did." Her eyes flicked to him, and for the first time all morning, she let a small smile ghost across her face. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it hit harder than if she'd laughed. "You've been looking in the wrong places," she said. The general's eyes narrowed, and something passed between them, a recognition that he was in the presence of someone who wasn't impressed by his rank, his training, or his reputation. Thompson tried to lighten it. "Ma'am, with respect, you've got to tell us you don't just wake up one day and do that." She took another sip, her gaze still on the horizon. "You'd be surprised what you can wake up and do when the alternative is dying. That shut them up again." The wind picked up, brushing the edge of the range with a low sigh. Dust swirled around boots. Somewhere out in the grass, a meadowlark called, its bright notes startling against the quiet. Hartwell broke it again, stepping forward until he was only a few feet from her. "I want to know your name." She studied him for a long moment, as if weighing whether he'd earned it yet. Finally, she set the thermos lid back in place, slid the cup into the groove on top. Her hand went to the chest pocket of her overalls. The men leaned forward slightly, the smallest ripple of anticipation moving through them. She pulled out a wallet. Old leather, cracked, the edges softened by decades. From it, she drew a laminated card. The colors faded, the edges worn white. She held it between two fingers, not offering it immediately, letting Hartwell see the weight it carried before it ever touched his hand. He took it. It was a military ID, Army. The photograph was of a younger woman, same eyes, same set to the mouth, but in dress blues adorned with medals and ribbons. The name was printed in bold. Staff Sergeant Annie Oakley Morrison. Hartwell read it twice before the name actually connected, and when it did, his fingers tightened slightly around the card. He'd heard the name before. Everyone in certain circles had, but it was a name that came with more rumor than record, more whispers than confirmed reports. Stories told late at night in barracks, in the quiet between missions. Stories you weren't sure were real. He looked up at her, the wind tugging at the edges of his uniform. "You're—" She took the ID back before he could finish, slid it into her pocket. "I was," she said. Rodriguez took a step forward, his voice low. "The ghost of Kandahar." The words landed heavy. Even Jenkins, too young to have been in the same theaters when those stories were fresh, knew the name. Williams muttered, "That shot. The one on the Taliban commander." Official range was 1847 meters. She glanced at him, a faint flicker of humor in her eyes. "Official reports are tidy. The real distance was 2,100, but the brass thought it. Sound like bragging." The men stood in stunned silence, the image of the woman in overalls colliding in their minds with the stories they'd heard. The impossible range shot, the record-holding scores, the years spent in places where the margin between life and death was the width of a bullet. Hartwell's mouth worked once, twice, before he spoke. You trained with the AM, you?" She nodded once. 87 to 2012, 17 records. Some of them still stand. It wasn't arrogance. It was simple truth, and it somehow carried more weight than if she'd shouted it from a mountaintop. The general looked past her now, to the range, to the scattered targets bearing the impossible proof of what she'd done, and something in his posture shifted. This wasn't just a woman who could shoot. This was someone who had just reminded his best men that there was always another level. She picked up the thermos again, took one last sip, and set it down. "That's enough for today," she said, turning back toward her trailer. The men watched her go, none of them speaking. Even the general stayed still. They all knew they'd just been schooled, not just in shooting, but in presence, in the kind of silent authority that didn't need volume or rank. And for the first time since they'd arrived, the Broken Arrow Range was quiet again. Why was it so hard to walk away? The general stayed at the firing line long after Annie had turned toward her trailer. He wasn't staring at her retreating figure. He was looking past her, at the field of targets scattered downrange, plates swaying gently in the wind, clay dust drifting where airborne targets had been cut from the sky. The memory of each impossible hit replayed in his mind with the weight of an unshakable fact. Every man here had just been outclassed. Rodriguez finally broke the silence. "Sir, what now?" It wasn't the kind of question Delta men usually asked. It carried no tactical urgency, no reference to orders. It was softer, more personal. Hartwell didn't answer right away. His pride was a wall he didn't know how to climb over yet. All morning, he'd been the voice, commanding, instructing, narrating their skill for a civilian audience he thought couldn't comprehend it. Now, the only voice that mattered had been the one they barely heard at all. Jenkins clicked his phone. Screen dark. He hadn't even reviewed the footage yet. Part of him wasn't sure he wanted to. Watching it once had been enough to make him question every hour he'd ever put behind a trigger. Williams bent to pick up a spent casing, rolling it between his fingers. "Sir, we can't just pretend that didn't happen." Hartwell's gaze stayed on the range. "No, we can't." Thompson shifted uneasily. She's not going to train us, is she?" Rodriguez gave a dry laugh without humor. "If I were her, I wouldn't waste my time." But as they spoke, the sound of boots on dirt returned. Slow, steady, Annie walked back toward them, the thermos dangling from one hand, her other hand slipping into the pocket of her overalls. She stopped at the edge of the firing line, looking at them one by one. "You're good," she said finally. "All of you, but good isn't always enough." It wasn't an insult. It was a statement, one they could feel settling in their bones. Hartwell straightened. "Staff Sergeant, I'd like to extend an invitation." His voice was careful now. stripped of the easy arrogance from before. Stay a few days, train my men. Show them whatever it was you just did out there. She studied him. The pause was long enough to make a couple of the younger soldiers glance down, like boys waiting for a verdict. These are good men, she said at last. Young, sharp, but you're right. They haven't seen everything, and what they don't know can kill them. Williams met her gaze. Then teach us. Annie's eyes moved back to the general. I'll give you 3 days, but I don't teach from a podium, I teach from the dirt. Rodriguez smirked faintly. Ma'am, we live in the dirt. Her expression didn't change. Not like this, you don't. That night, they stayed in the small town nearby, a place of one main street, 2 diners, and a handful of dusty storefronts. Hartwell paid for the coffee tab at the cafe on the corner. Just as he promised, the locals noticed. Word spread quickly that something unusual was happening at the range. The men were quieter than usual over dinner. No trading exaggerated stories about the day's shooting. No casual ribbing. Instead, the conversation circled back, again and again, to details they'd noticed about her technique. She wasn't just reading the wind, Williams said. She was reading the whole range, like she could feel it. Jenkins leaned forward. Did you see her stance changes? No wasted motion, none. It was like each position was already built into the one before it. Rodriguez shook his head, and she didn't miss. Not once, not even by an inch. You can't train that. Thompson pushed his coffee aside. Then what the hell is she going to teach us? The answer came at sunrise. They returned to the range to find Annie already there. She'd moved the targets again, some further, some at odd angles, some partially obscured by brush or terrain. A few were tucked into shadowed gullies where the morning light made them hard to pick out. She was sitting on her crate, sipping coffee. When they arrived, she stood and walked toward them. No ceremony. Today, you learn what happens when the manual doesn't work. Hartwell glanced at her setup. This isn't standard training. No, she said simply. Standard training gets you good. We're aiming for alive. The first drill wasn't about firing at all. She made them walk the range on foot, no rifles, just spotting scopes and notepads. She asked them to record every environmental factor they could see. Wind patterns, mirage lines, natural backstops, light angles. Most of them worked quickly. Too quickly. When they returned, she flipped through their notes, shaking her head. You're looking for obvious signs, she said. But out there, she nodded toward the far hills. Obvious signs are the first things the enemy learns to hide from you. She sent them back out. This time, slower. She told them to listen as well as look. Count the seconds between wind gusts. Watch how the grass bends on the ridgeline. Find the insects hovering in warm pockets of air. They tell you about the wind before your skin did. By the time they returned again, the sun had shifted. So had the wind. She didn't. Let them rest. She handed each man a rifle and gave them a single order. Adapt. Rodriguez went first. His shot was clean, tight grouping at 300. She didn't praise it. She moved his target 50 yards back and to the left, into a shadow with a crosswind, and told him to fire again. His round missed by 6 inches. Good. Shooting doesn't matter if you can't read the field, she said. By midday, they were sweating in the Wyoming heat, frustrated, their notes smeared with graphite and dust. But they were also listening more carefully, moving with more patience, checking every element before touching the trigger. Hartwell watched all of it. He'd come here expecting to demonstrate superiority, to show a civilian the limits of the gap between soldier and citizen. Now, he found himself on the other side of that lesson. Annie called a halt late in the afternoon. Tomorrow, we'll work on positions, she said. But you won't be firing from the ones you've been taught. Thompson frowned. If they're unstable, she cut him off gently. Unstable is a matter of training. Sometimes the only shot you get is from a place you can barely hold. If you've never done it, you'll miss. And missing isn't an option. They didn't argue. The sun was dropping when she walked back toward her trailer, her silhouette cutting across the long shadows. The men stayed where they were, watching her go. There was something unshakable in her pace. Not defiance, not arrogance, but the steadiness of someone who had carried weight far heavier than their judgment. Rodriguez finally spoke, almost to himself. She's going to break us down before she builds us back up. Hartwell didn't disagree, and as the first stars began to appear over the Wyoming plains, he knew something else too. By the time they left this place, every man here would see the world, and the shot, differently. Why did she start with the hardest thing first? The second morning came colder than expected. A front had rolled in overnight, and the wind had teeth now, steady enough to bite at faces, strong enough to throw a bullet wide if you didn't read it right. The men arrived layered in gear, pulling jackets tight, breath showing in the pale light. Annie was already there. Not just there, waiting, standing at the firing line with her arms crossed. The range behind her transformed again. Targets now sat in places that made no sense to them, tucked low behind brush, half hidden in shadow, tilted at odd angles. A few were barely visible without glass. Rodriguez muttered, "These aren't even standard silhouettes," she heard him. "Good," she said simply. When Hartwell stepped up beside her, she handed him a folded piece of paper. Inside were crude hand-drawn diagrams of body shapes. Nothing to scale, just outlines. "Today's lesson isn't about center mass," she said. "It's about the shot you have, not the one you wish you had." She walked them downrange to a set of positions she'd marked. Each one was worse than the last. Prone behind a pile of uneven rocks, kneeling on an incline, standing with one foot braced in soft dirt. "This is where the manuals fail you," she said. "They teach you perfect stances for perfect conditions. Trouble is, perfect conditions don't exist when someone's trying to kill you." Williams tried the first position, prone over rocks. His bipod wouldn't sit level, and every adjustment made the rifle slide. He glanced up at her, frustrated. "Stop fighting the ground," she told him. "Work with it. Let it settle you." It took him 3 minutes to find something that felt remotely stable. His shot landed low left. Annie didn't comment. She just shifted him to the next target. By midday, they were all struggling. Thompson's kneeling position on an incline had his muscles shaking before he could break the shot. Jenkins fought the wind on a partial profile target until sweat dripped into his eyes. Despite the cold, every miss was met with the same calm response from her. Adjust. No sighs, no raised voice, no impatience, just that single instruction. Over and over, the general stood back, watching his men get frustrated, watching their confidence splinter. But he also saw something else, the way they were starting to slow down, to think more, to move with a different kind of intent. Rodriguez finally managed to land a solid hit from a near-impossible crouch behind a fence post. He glanced toward Annie, half expecting approval. She only nodded once and moved him to the next station. Somehow, that small nod felt bigger than any compliment. When they broke for water, she didn't sit. She walked the range, checking targets, marking the hits and misses, making notes in a small, battered notebook. Hartwell stepped beside her. "You've got them rattled," he said. "They'll recover," she replied. "Rattled is good. Makes room for something new. Is this how you trained?" She looked at him for a beat, then back downrange. "No, this is how I learned. Training is what someone else gives you. Learning is what you take for yourself when no one's coming to save you." The afternoon was worse. She had them firing into the wind at targets so far and small they were little more than flecks in the glass. The gusts made the grass bow in waves, and every man had to wait for his moment, feeling rather than calculating when the shot would hold. Thompson missed 3 in a row. On the 4th, he squeezed too fast. Yanking the rifle off target, Annie stepped behind him, spoke low enough that only he could hear. "You're trying to beat it," she said. "You don't beat the wind. You let it tell you when it's ready." He glanced up at her, unsure if she was joking. She wasn't. When he fired again, slower this time, the plate rang. By evening, their muscles ached from holding awkward positions. Their eyes were raw from squinting into shifting light, and their pride had been whittled into something quieter, more focused. She called them in just as the sun was bleeding into the horizon. "Tomorrow's different," she said. "Bring gloves you don't mind tearing up." They didn't ask why. The third day began before dawn. Frost clung to the grass, and their breath fogged the air. Annie led them not to the firing line, but to a narrow cut in the land where a dry creek bed wound between low banks. "Down," she said, and slid into the cold dirt herself. They followed, their boots and knees instantly caked with frost-stiff mud. From here, the range looked alien, angles warped, distances deceptive, lines of sight broken. "Fieldcraft," she said simply. "Half the shot is getting into the place where you can make it. Today, you earn your positions." She didn't just place them in hides, she made them build them, scraping out hollows, stacking rocks, weaving grass to break the line of their scopes. Gloves tore, fingers numbed. Dirt crept under collars and sleeves. Rodriguez cursed softly. As a stone shifted under him, "Stability comes before comfort," Annie said. Moving past without breaking stride, they worked all morning without firing a single round. By the time they did, the wind had shifted again, and the temperature had climbed just enough to throw off their earlier reads. Hartwell joined in, unwilling to let his men take the lesson alone. By midday, he was shoulder-deep in a dug-in firing position, his boots slick with mud, his breath ragged from holding low for too long when the last target fell. Annie didn't offer congratulations. She just said, "Now you know what the manuals leave out." Back at the firing line, as they packed up, she finally broke her silence. "You've got skill," she said, her gaze moving over each man. "But skill without adaptability is just a party trick. You adapt or you die." No one argued. That night, in the small-town diner, they didn't talk about their hits. They talked about the places they'd missed before they'd adjusted, about the odd positions that worked when nothing else did, about how much of the day had been spent listening to the field rather than fighting it. And somewhere between the coffee and the quiet, each man realized they'd already started looking at the next day differently, because whatever Annie Morrison had left to teach them, they knew it wouldn't be in any book they'd ever read. Why did the range feel different before the first shot was even fired? The fourth morning was still, the kind of stillness that made every small sound louder. The crunch of boots on frost, the creak of a sling, the slow, practiced snap of a bolt sliding forward. The men arrived in a loose formation, no longer bounding ahead to the line, no longer carrying themselves with that sharp, outward swagger. They'd been stripped of it. Not humiliated, refined. Annie was there already. Of course, she didn't greet them. She didn't have to. She was standing at the edge of the range, looking downwind, a battered notebook in one hand, her thermos in the other. The targets were set in ways they no longer found surprising. No straight rows, no uniform distances, but something about them felt heavier today. The shots would be harder, yes, but that wasn't the real test. They could feel it in her silence. Hartwell stepped up beside her, scanning the field. "Last day," he said. She took a sip from her thermos. "Last chance," she corrected. The drills began without fanfare. Williams took the first position, prone in a depression where the wind tunneled and curled unpredictably. A month ago, he would have taken his first. Shot too soon, trying to muscle the rifle against the gusts. Now, he lay still, watching the movement of grass and dust, counting heartbeats, adjusting his hold in fractions. When he fired, the steel rang. He didn't smile. He just rolled to the side and let Jenkins take his place. Jenkins, once impatient, now moved with a kind of deliberate slowness that hadn't been in him before. He didn't scan the target first. He scanned the field, tracing how the sun's angle played against the shadows, noting the way a flag half a mile out was moving differently than the one beside his plate. His shot landed. True, Thompson, who'd been the most talkative at the start of all this, had said nothing since arriving. He took his awkward kneeling position without complaint, adjusted for the incline in one smooth motion, and sent his round into a swinging steel silhouette with a sharp, echoing clang. Rodriguez, the most seasoned of them, wasn't shooting tighter. He was shooting smarter. He no longer wasted time overcorrecting for every gust. His adjustments were small, almost imperceptible, and when his target fell, Annie gave the smallest of nods. Hartwell watched each man, his chest tightening with something he didn't want to call pride just yet. He could see the difference in them, not just in their technique, but in their eyes. They weren't just firing at targets anymore. They were reading the world between themselves and the target, letting it shape the shot. When his turn came, the general didn't expect special treatment. Annie gave him a position that was awkward, exposed, and uncomfortable, the kind of firing point he'd have told his men to avoid if possible. He took it without a word. The shot was harder than he expected. Wind shearing across the angle, light fading behind a shifting cloud. He felt himself rushing, the old habits clawing back in. Then, without thinking, he did what he'd seen her do for 3 days straight. He let it settle, waited until the rifle felt like part of the ground. The plate rang. When he stood, Annie's eyes met his for a moment. Unreadable. Then she turned away, calling out the next drill. The day went on like that. No praise, no lectures, just the work. They cycled through positions, distances, and conditions until the sun had burned a shallow arc across the sky and the wind carried the smell of distant sage. In the early afternoon, she called them all to the line. No rifles, no gear. Walk with me, she said. They followed her downrange, weaving between the targets, past the markers they'd been aiming at all week. She stopped beside a battered steel plate, its surface pocked with years of hits, but the fresh mark from today's drill dead center. This, she said, tapping the plate with a knuckle, is the easy part. Pulling the trigger is the smallest part of the job. The rest is getting here alive, steady, and ready to make it count. She moved to the next target, partially hidden behind a low rise. If you can't adapt, if you can't make the shot when nothing lines up the way it should, you're just a tourist with a weapon. No one argued, no one even shifted their weight. They walked the rest of the course in silence, her voice occasionally cutting through the wind to point out a detail they'd missed, a change in soil color that meant different mirage patterns, the way a line of brush could trick the eye into misjudging distance, the tiny swirl of dust that marked a sheltered wind pocket. By the time they reached the far end of the range, the light had begun to change again. The prairie stretched around them, vast and quiet. Annie turned to face them, her expression softer than it had been all week. You're better now than you were when you got here, she said, not because you can hit more targets, but because you're paying attention to the things you used to ignore. She let that hang for a moment. Out there, she went on, the things you ignore are the things that kill you. Never forget that. The general nodded once. We won't. She studied him for a moment, as if weighing the truth of that. Then she gave a faint, almost invisible smile. Good. The walk back was quiet. No one filled the air with chatter or bravado. The range felt different now, less like a place they'd come to prove themselves, more like a place they'd been shown something they couldn't unlearn. At the firing line, Annie unslung the rifle she'd used on the first day, laid it across the bench. She didn't offer it to anyone this time. She simply picked it up, settled into a position without fuss, and sent a round downrange. The steel at 1,000 yards rang, sharp and clean. She stood, set the rifle down again, and without another word, walked toward her trailer. They watched her go. None of them moved until the door closed behind her. Rodriguez was the first to speak, his voice low. "We came here thinking we'd show her something." Hartwell glanced at him. "We did," Rodriguez frowned. "What?" The general's eyes were still on the trailer. "We showed her we could learn." Why did it feel like leaving was harder than arriving? The convoy was packed by mid-morning, gear stowed, rifles cased, brass police from the line, until the range looked untouched again. The soldiers moved with quiet efficiency, but not the same energy they'd had when they first rolled in. The cocky chatter was gone, so was the need to fill silence now. Their movements carried the same measured calm they'd seen in her, a different kind of readiness. Hartwell walked the line one. Last time, checking for forgotten gear, he didn't find any. What he did find was the ghost of every shot they'd fired over the past days. Not in the ground or the targets. Those would fade. But in the way his men now held themselves. Shoulders lower, breathing steadier, heads turning, eyes scanning the small details in the wind and light without even realizing they were doing. Annie emerged from her trailer without hurry. Thermos in hand, she walked toward them as if this were just another ordinary morning on the range, not the end of something unspoken. "Heading out?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," Hartwell said. "We've taken enough of your time." She shrugged lightly. "Time spent right isn't wasted." Rodriguez stepped forward, his usual booming confidence tempered now into something quieter. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say—" He trailed off, searching for words, then simply nodded. "Thank you." She met his eyes for a moment, then looked at the rest of them. "You're welcome, but don't thank me until it counts. Out there, in the places that matter, that's when you'll know if you learned anything worth keeping." They understood. Williams cleared his throat. "You ever think about writing it down? The way you teach?" Her mouth curved into the faintest smile. "The people who need it will find it. Same way you did." Jenkins, who had barely spoken since that first day, finally stepped forward. "Ma'am, that first morning. We laughed, we thought, I know what you thought," she said gently, cutting him off. "Doesn't matter. All that matters is you're not the same men who drove up here." They weren't, and they all knew it. Hartwell glanced at the sky. The wind was steady now, carrying the faint scent of rain from somewhere far off. "If you ever wanted to consult for General," she said, and the way she said it left no room for negotiation. "I've done my time. My place is here now." He didn't push. They shook hands, her grip firm but not showy, his lingering. Just a second longer than needed. When he let go, he knew it was the last time he'd stand on this dirt beside her. The SUV started up, engines idling low. The men climbed in without the usual jostling for position, even Thompson, who would have normally been filming everything for a laugh, left his phone in his pocket as the convoy began to roll away. Annie stayed at the firing line, thermos in hand, watching them shrink against the Wyoming horizon. She didn't wave. She didn't need to. Half a mile down the dirt road, Hartwell looked in his side mirror. She was still there, small against the open sky, unmoving. "Sir," Rodriguez said quietly from the passenger seat, "you think we'll see her again?" The general's eyes stayed on the mirror for another second before shifting back to the road. "No, and that's fine. Some people you only meet once. That's all it takes." The range disappeared behind a rise, and she was gone, back at the Broken Arrow. Annie turned and walked the line. She collected brass the way she always did, set fallen targets stands upright, tightened bolts that had worked loose. There was no ceremony, no indulgence in the memory of the past days. Just the work, the same as it had been before they came. When she reached her crate by the trailer, she sat, poured another small cup of coffee, and let her eyes drift over the prairie. The wind had shifted again. She could feel it on her cheek. Somewhere, she knew, those men were driving toward whatever waited for them next. And maybe, just maybe, they'd carry that awareness with them, the way she carried her own teachers. In the back of her mind, because that's how it worked, Lessons didn't belong to the people who taught them. They belonged to the people who survived because of them. She took a slow sip, the thermos warm against her hands. The grass bent in the breeze, the sky stretched wide, and the sound of the wind was the only applause she would ever need. No headlines, no medals, no speeches. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts, and then, when the work is done, it goes back to its coffee.